Okay, so I'm here with Sherry and Michael again. This is going to be part 5 of our ongoing discussion of the Apocalypse of St. John, although confusingly enough, we're talking about chapter 4 because we only got through the forward in our very first discussion. And our last discussion was on um, the Lamb of God image in Revelation and Bock's idea that it was actually a kind of New Testament heavenly point of view of what was going on in Genesis from the earthly point of view. And we talked about that. And then this chapter kind of begins about talking a little bit more about the same things and then kind of moves into its own content. So I think we talked about probably the first part of the chapter to me seems to sort of be recapping a lot of the themes from our last discussion. So maybe we can circle back around to it if there's something to be said to tie things together. But I was thinking maybe we should start with something that's more particular to this chapter. Do either of you have something that like you really want to talk about that stood out to you?
Oh, all of it.
Can you pick one
Yeah,
thing to
this
get us
is
started? Can you pick one thing to get us started? Yeah, there is a lot. I agree. This is there's a
Well,
lot in this chapter.
before we just whip to some particulars, I thought it was interesting that he points out that the seals were like the first stages of creation, right? They're describing creation in an evolutionary
In an
way,
evolutionary process, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I really liked that, and then also, I mean, we'll get to it, I guess, but it just in the beginning of chapter 4, he kind of does a little preamble and points out that the transition goes from pictures to word, right? From images to speaking.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and that follows also with that evolutionary transitioning through with the seals, right?
Right. And which also like is like symbolically linked to like why there are 7 of them, because 7 is as a number is a representation of the fullness of time. So it has a connection to time. So these seals are these cycles of 7 are all about the unfolding of these things in time.
Right.
And they don't the answer is the question. If you're asking the question like do they apply now to the past or to the future, the answer to all 3 questions is yes. So yes, it does. So or at least from Bach's point of view, and
I just need a
I would
brain
tend to
exploding
I would
hug.
tend to I would I would tend to agree with that because it's talking about patterns. It's talking about patterns of reality that
Right.
that are cyclical. So is there a specific so okay, so the things you talked about, since you talked about that, like the specific thing that he's talking about in this chapter in terms of like the opening of the seals, is he's focusing on the image of the horseman, of the horse and rider image.
Well,
And
before you jump into that he talks about this primitive idea. He calls it the primitive idea that man descends from animals, right?
yeah, I love that he calls the modern idea the primitive
I
idea.
know, I know, I know. And
Yeah.
I actually, I did some screenshots because of this. Where's my stuff? Sorry. Let me see here. Oh, I didn't. Oh, I highlighted it in the book. Hang on.
Okay. I let me just make sure that oh yeah, it's already set up so that all participants can share. So if you have something, if you do have a screenshot that you'd like to share, that option is open to you.
Oh,
Hey,
that's like way beyond my capacity.
okay, okay.
Technological skills.
Well, if you do,
I
like
just do this.
in the
Oh, like
future,
this.
if there's something, if there's some, in the future, if there's some kind of graphic that or visual image that you think could be helpful,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
have it set up so that you guys can share too.
I'll
So
have to learn that then. Um, geez, now I'm not.
you can just read whatever it is that you had highlighted that you wanted to draw attention to.
Yeah. Now I can't find it so badly.
One thing I'll just say while we're waiting here is I would
Yeah.
recommend to folks listening to actually read this book, because it is, we're having to give, sort of short shrift for all this stuff. And I feel like no matter what you say about this book, it is very good at making an interpretive kind of sort of map for it. It pulls out connections that for whatever reason just evade the modern consciousness. So you see things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, like in terms of how things connect, just the parallelisms between different structures and things. And like, I've read the book of Revelation, I don't know, countless times, but I didn't really pick up on any of this until he starts elucidating it and breaking it down.
Yeah, he's giving you another mode of reading the text, I think is what it comes down to. It's like I don't know, it's like it almost didn't occur to me to read the text that way because I had this like, this cultural tradition that I inherited of reading the text in a particular way that it's
Yeah.
just like it never would have occurred to me. And I actually find like it's a much more holistic way of reading the text. It's much more, it sees more.
Well, it doesn't
I
assume
would
that
say.
it doesn't assume that the text was written by a 20th or 21st century author. Right?
Right. Yeah, it
No,
doesn't. Right. Yes, it doesn't assume. Right. Because, well, yeah, Bach is definitely like falls within like you. There are like it's pretty obvious from this chapter that he is an evolution of consciousness thinker. Under the influence of Steiner primarily for Bach, but obviously that would connect him to Barfield too. And that makes him think about that. I mean, so that would make, because he thinks that way, if you're thinking in that mode, then you would realize that that's not the right way to approach the text, because you would realize that there's a difference between the consciousness that wrote this text and the consciousness that you have in your age,
right.
right? So, um, um,
I got my
Yeah.
quote. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so he just says, the primitive idea held almost universally today that man has evolved in straight descent from the animal kingdom is alien to the book of Revelation and is open to serious doubts generally. It is true that science has been at great pains to reconstruct the animal ancestry of man and to describe the individual animal species as the stages through which mankind has passed in its evolution. But the missing link has never been found. And yeah, I guess we can talk about more about that later because there's some interesting stuff there, I think. That
well,
he rejects that idea that man descends from animals, and that really matters in the way
he doesn't reject it on the material biological level though, necessarily. What he's saying is that what he's actually saying is that that's inconsequential.
well, there's that too.
He's saying that even if man evolved from lower forms of life, that there was something distinctly human about those lower, they would still not be the, like, whatever line you would trace us to, there would still be something distinctly human about it, even if it hadn't come into the fullness of its humanity yet.
Right, but
Right.
he says here, if man has physically also gone through a series of stages, which may be characterized as resembling animal forms,
Right.
he has nevertheless always, in italics, been more in italics than animal.
Exactly.
Right? So he's making, to me, he's making a pretty important distinction. Like I'm not saying that he doesn't believe in evolution. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
But he's pointing out something more, right?
Right.
He's pointing out something like the theory of evolution is reductionist. It births people like Richard Dawkins, right? And he's pointing out that man is, it's like man is everything and all
It's
things.
that, yeah, it's that thing, that quote you like
The
from
measure of all
Jacob Boehme.
things.
Well,
Right.
that there's a sort of microcosm in man that is representative of the whole,
Right.
so that you can find pieces of him scattered everywhere, or representations or parts of him.
Right, and this frankly
Amazing.
this frankly logically follows as a Christian if you're going to take seriously the notion that it is through Christ the Logos when that all things are created, because that does make it makes the Son of Man, the true Son of Man, in fact, the center of all things
Yeah. He also says here,
of necessity.
animals are the accompanying phenomena of man's formation. Therefore, each animal type is the symbol of a soul force in man. And I guess what I especially like about this, the way he's looking at it, is it helps me to look at it from a different perspective, right? Not this, top down looking at everything, vivisecting everything, right? But as an integral part of the thing itself.
Well, he's making a fundamental challenge to objective thinking is what he's doing. He's saying
Right.
that you can't, like, if your view of reality is based only on the objective, that you have only a half functional view of reality, that you need to have both the objective and subjective together, or you won't understand anything.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, so about in the light of what you were just saying, what do you think about the distinction he made between, he said something about the four beasts around the throne,
Yeah.
and contrasting them to the writers.
The riders?
Yes, he was talking about how, I'm trying to see if I can find it really quick. Yes, here we go. I think.
Yeah. There's a crucial difference between the four beasts around the throne.
Yes, that's it
and
right
the
there.
four horses. I'll just read it.
Yeah, thank you.
Around the throne of God in heaven, and the four horses proceeding from the seals of the book. The four beasts still bear the human element within them, and
Right.
the four horses are found within man.
Right.
And I actually jotted that down because I love that. I think that it is so subtle, but so profound.
Right.
The heathen mystical value, and then he goes into the,
more about the horse. Yeah.
More about the horse there. But
yeah.
that idea of the beasts bearing the human element, that goes back to what I just quoted, where he says, animals are the accompanying phenomena of man's formation, right? Therefore, each animal type is the symbol of a soul force in man. And I don't know about you guys, but it really makes my head like kind of do this. I don't know how else to explain it.
Well, I mean, to me, this relates to like, okay, you can like, if you think about like, to me, this relates to like what the proper, like, if you think this ties back to the idea of the man as the measure of all things. And then like, what a human being who is properly fulfilling their function in the hierarchy of heaven and earth is going to do. Like, look at how many saints are associated with like animals being like drawn to them and having like this really close kinship with animals. Well, and what's going on there is that the human being is bringing out the human element within the animal, which is like which is a reversal of sin, because sin is sin is the reduction of the human principle to the animal, whereas the saint brings the human principle
out of the animal,
out of the animal and raises it up and helps to raise it up the hierarchy. So
yeah, he says, today we should train ourselves so to energize our imaginative faculties that, remembering all things transient are but a likeness, we begin to recognize in every animal a part of our own being, but only a part of our being.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense that, you know, that you would have these forms of animism, right?
Right.
Because that's what they would be recognizing. They would be recognizing themselves. And I just had a long talk with someone this morning about, you know, George MacDonald's whole idea of, you know, and Harding, you know, the world outside is the same as the world inside. The world outside, MacDonald says, is the clothing by which we clothe our thoughts, right? We take those images from outside and we dress all the stuff that's on the inside,
Right.
right? And then unveil it to the world. That's what communicating is, right? And so everything, you know, like we talked about, was it in the McGilchrist thing, we talked about this, you know, kenosis, right, of Christ as the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, this outpouring of everything onto creation, which means that everything is one thing, right?
Well, it participates.
It's only one thing.
It
And so
participates.
it has to be in this reciprocal conversation with itself, right?
Well, it participates in, like, it has a participatory unity, I would say, but it
Mhm.
is, but it is, but it still remains distinct. But
Well,
this is,
yes, that's yes. Yes and no, because okay, so I was sitting at the lake on our property the other day, yesterday, and I was watching. There was a like a snipe or whatever, a little shorebird along the shore, and then right over his head there were these tree swallows catching flies, you know, and then there were a couple of ducks, and then a mother duck with some babies, and then I looked in the water, and there was full of tadpoles and freshwater shrimp, you know, swimming around, and I thought, if any one of these creatures decided that it wasn't what it was, okay,
right.
and decided to be something else, like the duck decided to be a shrimp, or or the shrimp decided to be a snipe, or the butterfly decided to be a fish, you know, then the whole ecosystem would collapse, right? Like
Right. So so there's an interdependence between between the unity and the multiplicity, and
right,
that without,
and the snipe makes its way along the shore with the tree swallows overhead, and without each other they would both cease to exist.
see,
Right?
that's that kind of mutual dependence between, what it is, it's almost like two different modes of unity. And that's like, this is what I keep trying to point out when I talk about, like the personalist model of the Trinity, and how that actually, like, is an image of how all reality functions, because all reality functions in accordance with that pattern, because it's the source. Like, that's the source.
Right, but if I hold up a snipe in one hand and a tree swallow in the other, they're both birds, but they're both completely different than each other. They both eat different foods, perform different functions, have different capabilities.
Right.
And yet, without them, without each other, their environment would cease to exist the way it does, right? There would be no land of milk and honey, let's say, right? It would be a desert or something. I mean, if the shrimp just suddenly all walked up the beach and turned into frogs, let's say, because they decided they weren't shrimp anymore, then the water would become putrid, because that's what their job is, to clean it.
Right.
And then every living thing around that lake would suffer, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just,
Yeah, you're talking about relation, which is like, I mean,
relationship. Yeah.
this is why, which I think that the ultimate source, like the ultimate source of that relation is grounded in the Trinity.
Right. And so when you see the snipe with the tree swallows flying overhead, does the snipe ever look up and say, I wish I was a tree swallow? Does he ever suffer envy?
No,
or
because animals don't have a problem with participating properly.
right.
Like,
He
that's
just
our
has
problem.
his head down, and it's as if the swallows flying overhead are just constantly blessing him, right, for the work that he's doing. And the whole thing speaks.
So this
of
is the perfect. So we're talking about kind of participatory conscious, especially since you talked about animism. So we're kind of talking about like participatory consciousness and what that has to say about what reality actually looks like. So I think that's the perfect segue into talking about the image of the white horse. Because I don't know, and I want to get Michael's opinion on this. To me, when I was reading the way Bock described the image of the white horse, it seemed to me like he was describing like the consciousness of original participation. Michael?
What was it that drew you to that?
Hold on a second. Let me see if I can I can see, because he talks about, because it has to do with the way he contrasts it with let's see here. Okay, when the first seal is open, the white horse appears. The rider who sits on it is crowned with a gleaming golden crown. He holds the bow bent in his hand and is called the Conqueror. This is the apocalyptic picture of the initial stage of human thinking. To suppose that the beginning of mankind was primitive and without intelligence is one of the fundamental errors of the materialistic world conception. Thinking did not evolve from primitive movements of the brain. At first, thinking was prerogative of the gods, and then the gods gave man a share in their thoughts. The first stage of human thinking is entirely illumined by divine light.
Yeah.
Man himself does not really yet think. So to me, that points toward the lack of like as firm an individual identity. On the human brow, higher beings are thinking. Again, that suggests to me it's like, so it's like the feeling of like the God entering into you. To me, it's like what he's saying here is like definitely like seems to be a strong parallel with the consciousness and original participation.
Yeah,
which is going to like, and he's showing an evolutionary descent through these successive images, right? Because it's like, okay, it starts off, you know, in the white horse, and then immediately what comes next is the red horse, which is kind of like the red horse basically sounds like a description of mimetic rivalry. It's like it's the war of all against all.
Well, okay, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I was just gonna say it's also interesting that he uses this plural of the gods,
right?
Which I think is very interesting because that's clearly the picture in Revelation, that there's this sort of multitude nature to the hierarchy, the heavenly hierarchy, and that's also, you know, what you see in the Old Testament too. There's this plural use of that term that we've kind of, again, we've desired a sort of flattening out of that complexity, but. And again, this relates to these evolution of consciousness, because in the Barfieldian scheme, right, it's not just a change in psychologically how humans change, it's also sort of this ontological change in this larger sphere, and how like we're playing a role in terms of how we participated with it, but it's actually being shaped by our failure to participate with it in some sense. Like there's a real interesting kind of back and forth in how these interplay with each other. And it is interesting here. It's like, you know, like the human isn't thinking for himself. He's kind of being thought through, and he's okay with that. That like feels natural. It's like there's a sort of union there. And I think it's interesting too, where it talks about this. I don't know why he uses this term. It's like through the power of thinking, man acquires the faculty of sure aim. So there's this, and again, it's this conqueror imagery that seems, you know, evocative of you know, Adam being given some sort of dominion. Yeah, it is all interesting. I mean, it's funny because like until you pointed back to this, I forgot what my initial thoughts were reading this, because I have like these other layers, these other mappings for these different things that are
gotcha,
that's so corrupt and kind of dominate because they have a much greater history to them in my own,
Yeah.
Right.
my own story. But
Yeah.
this is clearly pointing that I think what you just
Yes,
said.
I thought, yeah, and I thought you would see that too, because you're so well read when it comes to Barfield, and it was just kind of like that was just jumping out on the page. It's like, oh, he's talking about original participation, and I also think this ties to this. That's also kind of predicts what's going to happen with the rest of the path with these horsemen too, right?
Yep.
Because we know that those gods are going to fall. I mean, they started off yeah, they started off as like sons of God and members of the divine council, but they screwed it up. Now, whether here's the question. Okay, this is maybe a big sidetrack. Do you think that they actually like screwed it on purpose, or were they just
Who's
at
they? Who's they?
the
Before
gods? The gods.
gods.
Yes.
Well,
Was there error like really an error of malevolence, or was it one of ignorance?
the Greeks would say they did it on purpose.
Well, they were worshiping him, so we ought to. But no, but
They're always playing with us, right? They're always playing with us. But
Yeah.
but I would have to assume that that's not the God that I know, right? So
No, I'm talking about the gods now. I'm actually talking about the pagan gods.
the pagan gods.
I'm talking about the pagan gods,
They did
and
it.
I'm just kind of like, and I'm kind of like taking it for.
Do we even need to draw those sharp distinctions? Like, I mean,
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
because it seems like whatever there is, it's was instituted by God, and it whatever sustenance allows it to continue is continually provided by God. So it's like it's all within this framework that is part of the
Yeah.
creation.
Yeah.
It's and to me, like, it doesn't even seem to me to even draw really sharp distinctions between good and evil, although I think we have to, right? We have to discern, but there's also, I don't know, I think there's
but
like
we don't
even
want to
maybe
be no, but that's good though, Michael, because we don't want to draw too sharp of a distinction between good and evil. I don't think, because like to me, it's like the idea of understanding evil as like a privation
yeah.
is the best
Well,
way of understanding it. And if we give like evil like too much positive
Substance.
ontological reality
Yeah.
and substance in its own right, then I think that is a mistake. So
right. Because oftentimes what we mean by evil is oftentimes something as simple as just putting something that's lower above the higher. Like, it's not
Right.
that this lower thing is actually good, but it's being somehow subverted and pushing
In the
other things
wrong
out of the
spot.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So I think
Right.
your question about whether it was intentional or not is a good question. And the other question I think that's interesting is to what role is humanity causing it versus what role is it being, is it a victim? In fact, like, I
Right.
feel like you
Yeah.
can't really say that because
Yes.
I feel like both are doing
How
both,
much are we
like,
actually
involved.
how much are we actively generating the principalities and powers?
Because
Well,
in
that's
some
kind of
sense,
like,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
going back to us being kind of the microcosm of everything, it's like we are like the kind of the pawns on the chessboard in a certain sense, but like, so we are like the real battlefield of what's being fought over. And so, like, for anything to be meaningfully gained, won, or lost, it all involves the movements and decisions that we're making. So, like, we're having to play some role, but the question is, like, what's the chicken or the egg in terms of causing it? It's hard to say.
I would think of it this way. I would say, what part of the tapestry is a victim? What part of the tapestry suffers for no reason? None of it. Right? The whole
Mhm.
tapestry is necessary for the whole tapestry to be. And every part of that tapestry plays a role and has a different shape and a different color and moves in another direction. But no part of that tapestry is less or more than the whole thing itself, right?
Okay, that's really interesting, Sherry. I have to think about that one. I definitely have to think about that one.
I just want to say one more thing about the white horse, because
Go for it.
there's a Peterson reference here. Because the crown is symbolic of thought, and the bow is symbolic of aim. And it made me immediately think about Peterson, right?
Yes.
Because he talks a lot about that. And I find it interesting. I don't think he's making that one-to-one comparison with this, but it's interesting that the two things come together over and over again, right? Thought and aim. Like you have to think, which usually implies some kind of forward thinking, right? So, and
predict
so
the future,
as does aim, right? And you have to be able to focus in, which I believe is somewhat detrimental to us.
There's a thing that he mentions in passing. I don't know if either of you remember, where he contrasts like the first appearance of the rider on the white horse, and he mentions that like there's only a single crown, but then in the second appearance where we were associated with Christ, it's multiple.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah, he talks
multiple
about that.
crowns.
Yeah.
12 crowns, I think. In fact, is that
Yeah.
right?
6 or something. I thought it was 6 crowns and 6 horns or something like that. But I can't
Well,
remember.
that's the seven eyes and 7 horns is the lamb.
No, there was a different one too, because I never actually ever noticed that before. But is that in this chapter?
I think he's
But
previewing what's going to come
yeah,
later.
it is in this chapter. He does make even though it's about something that comes later, he does mention it in this chapter. And the only reason I mention it is I was kind of curious as to like what if there's anything to be read into the fact that like there's a single crown before, but then when it reappears, there's multiple crowns.
I haven't thought about that.
Okay, we can maybe touch that. Maybe that will be something that we can circle back to when we actually come to that image being discussed in more in depth. So, what do we want to say about the other horses, the red, the black, and the pale horse?
Well, I got lots to say about the other horses. Hey, slow down there, buddy.
Oh, okay. And does anybody want to say anything about like does anyone want to say anything about what he says about like the horse imagery in general and its like and its connection to ancient Germanic and Greek thought and all that?
it was a sign of intelligence. You could basically say that, right? Like the horse skull was what do you call that? Venerated or whatever in these cultures as a sign of intelligence.
Yeah, and of human mastery.
And of human mastery, yeah.
But he talks about like the helmet of Athena and Pericles.
Yeah.
And talks about like the way that houses are decorated in northern Germany and and then of course you have a lot of these ancient like horse twin gods too, which is not a thing that he mentioned, but it's something that he could have brought up because there is kind of like and these horse twins they're also like they're horses, but they're also anthropomorphized. So I think there's a connection to this horse and rider kind of idea too. Hengist and Horsa would be like the Anglo-Saxon kind of version of that. But
there's as a horse person, like I've trained horses, broke horses, ridden horses. Right. And I've had many, many, many other animals. And there is a bond between a human being and a horse that I haven't found anywhere else. And it's a very, very, it's a kind of synchronicity that really, that you enter the flow state when you're participating in it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so when you're riding a horse and you know the horse and, you know, you've worked with the horse and the horse knows you and everybody's on board. It's like one thing is moving. You're thinking and the animal is doing your bidding. And you can literally ride that way. You can ride without a bridle, without a saddle, right? All you have to do is just slightly move and the animal will respond and go wherever you're looking, which is just like completely mind-boggling, right? So I can see why ancient cultures would really honor the horse in that sense, because the horse is very special in the animal kingdom in that regard.
Right. And the horse and rider is particularly important, like symbolically. Uh, um, and it, and I can't help but think of like the centaur, which is like an inversion of that, right? Where it's like instead of the human being charged and bringing the human element out of the horse and
Well, that's
raising
what
the
you
horse up the
feel like.
hierarchy, in the centaur you have the precise opposite thing going on, where the human is being dragged down to the animal level by giving itself over to its animal impulses.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. And I said synchronicity there, but I meant synergy. I made it. I made
gotcha.
it.
Yeah. Um yeah, there's just like, and horses like always capture our imagination too.
Yeah.
So, um, um,
But
and
about the red horse.
yes,
Okay, so the red horse, the bow is replaced by the sword, which is interesting. Like you talked about mimetic rivalry, but
yeah, the way he talks about it, let me find the actual text, because let's see here. The seal of the red horse proceeds. To him who sits on it, power is given to take peace from the earth and to sow strife among men.
yeah,
He holds not a bow, but a sword in his hand, with which man fights against man. The transition from the white to the red color is very expressive. With it, the breaking up of light into multiplicity of colors begins. Man must begin to make the divine intelligence his own. It must be linked with his own bloodstream, which too has gradually withdrawn from the universal circulation of cosmic forces and grown into a self contained unit. Thought becomes humanized and compressed into the soul of the individual.
yeah.
And so on. So that to me
That,
is like, that's like, oh, he also specifically later on, he ties it to like egoism, strife, etc. So that's why it's like, to me, it's like, that's why I tied it to like mimetic rivalry. So it's like, it's the bringing of division. And I think this is like, I would say we can link this to the beginning of like, if I'm right in seeing the white rider, the initial rider on the white horse being connected to original participation,
mhm.
which is bound to fall because of the downsides that are built into that, or just like because of God's long-term intentions. um, that that seems to be, if seems to be linked to original participation, and then as there's a in that original participatory consciousness, there's less like there's less egoic identity. There's less explicit ego consciousness. So
Mhm.
the red horse kind of represents like the beginnings of this withdrawal into ego consciousness, which creates all the kinds of things that we associate with it.
Well, he says it's a transition into multiplicity,
Right.
which I liked, and then the idea that that thought becomes ensouled and thus grows more and more individualized, right? Which is what you were just
Yeah.
saying about the ego
Right.
consciousness, right? So it's just like,
Yeah, like a lot of like, even like if you look at like if you read some of the anthropology about like some of like even the of the tribes that have like maintained their traditional ways of life for even into modernity, and you read about like how they actually like think about they don't really have like this same kind of defined sense of self that we do. Like they don't they naturally see themselves as not only very interconnected with the other members of their own tribe, but also interconnected with their environment
yeah,
and everything else around them. It's like they see themselves as more as like
a
as
whole,
a part of a whole.
as a
Yeah.
whole.
And so what this movement of the red horse represents is that the necessary, I would say, ultimately, movement away from that, because God's going to bring something ultimately wonderful out of this, but it is for the time being, it's creating all of this
Chaos.
chaos and warfare and strife and rivalry.
You want to jump to the black horse?
Yeah, sure. I'll
Um,
let someone else talk about the black horse since I just went on about the red horse for a while. I'm gonna refill my coffee while someone talks about the black horse.
Well, I just liked these because they were so well, they were such good descriptors of like what Nate was talking about in the beginning of what Barfield talks about. And
Yes.
metaphorically speaking, they were perfect descriptors of what Barfield talks about. So the black horse is that tragic break, and I just interpreted it as a form of transactionalism. Like the black horse represents this transactional culture that arises out, right?
Oh, yeah, it's mammon basically.
It's mammon.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, so it begins. So we have like the strife and mimetic rivalry that comes first, but there's still, think about that as like it's still very human, right?
Yeah.
So what's going on with the black horse is like it is a move toward it's a move toward a further loss of humanity.
Well, he says here, the transition which first led from spirit to soul now leads from soul to matter. So it's materialism, right? It's mammon, it's transactionalism, it's all that. Like he talks about I don't know why I wrote that there, but I have
it's also, I mean, it's literally death. So it's like it's the taking of the life. So it's the taking of life out of the world.
This one is not death, is it?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, what's the pale horse?
The pale horse.
No, the rider of the pale horse is death.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes, it's. You are correct. I got ahead of myself. But the pale horse is more than just death though, because it actually represents a move toward the demonic.
Yeah, but let's not talk about that yet.
Right. So I believe that I'm connecting that descent into materiality as death though, because
well, that's where it goes.
Because life is the white and red ray coming from the throne of glory, right?
Yeah.
That's where so like the black is a descent into a living death. Can we put it that way?
Well,
it's not.
That's actually a really cool way to put it. Because I see if I can gather my thoughts here coherently.
Living death of a mind that is now so obsessed with materiality that it has completely lost sight of the living world, that the consciousness that was still in the time of the white horse would be able to see.
Okay, well, think of it this way. So the transition, according to him, is spirit to soul to matter. White, red, black, right?
Right.
And traditionally, white, red, and black also indicate spirit, soul, and body. Body, right? And what does the New Testament describe it? Paul talks about this body of
death.
Death. Yeah, that's exactly, yes.
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 So that's
really why great. This is why this is not something Bock said. This is my own symbolic intuition. Is like I would say that the pale horse actually represents spiritual death.
Yeah, well, yeah, the black horse is the sphere of the living to the dead, moving.
Do we also care to define what we mean when we say spirit and soul? Like, how do those two? Because I feel like those two things get confused.
Yeah, they're used as synonyms.
It's an ancient way of talking.
Okay, so this is when I make spirit and soul separate things. This is what I mean. To me, And this is why, and this is clearly Bock is thinking along these lines too,
Yeah.
because he connects it to the blood, right? So what the soul is like it's that animal life force, that animating life force. So soul is common to not just human beings have souls. Like animals have souls too. Like anything that anything that moves itself about the world, right? That has some power of self locomotion, um, is has a soul. Which is like the principle of its animal unity, which is symbolically uh in the Bible always represented as blood. Like blood
Yeah.
is that's what blood is. Blood is that animating life force, the soul.
And
Um,
Barfield also talks about a lot about
a
like a
lot,
sort of
yes.
group soul. Like so like say like a flock of birds sort of participate in a
That's anthroposophic. That's an
Right.
right.
anthroposophic
Well,
thought.
but there is also like there also is a like there's an implicit like in addition to what I'm saying, there's also this notion that the soul is like the material unity of a thing. So which is why you can like which is why you can
Oh,
actually
that's cool, yeah.
philosophically talk about like group soul without necessarily doing it in anthroposophical terms, I would
Mm,
say.
okay.
But I don't know if that's helpful or not. I think like, well, I don't know. Like Dallas Willard says that God has a soul, and I don't know we want to go into that because that confuses the heck out of me. So I don't know what he could possibly mean. He means it, but the reason I bring up Willard is that Willard is using it in addition to it being aware of the Aristotelian definition. He's also using it to mean like the principle of unity. So I think it's like soul is like I think that's Willard's way of talking about what would be classically called the ousia of God. Like I
Okay, and the
think
spirit, so the soul is the, are you saying,
the unifying principle of the thing.
and the
Yeah, it
spirit,
seems like it seems like it's playing some sort of mediating
But
role between.
that's actually more confusing than we need to go to. Let's just throw that out for a minute
Okay, so but then
because
what do we mean by spirit then?
the idea of it being like the animating life principle of the thing is more what Bach is talking about.
yeah,
So spirit is that divine part within the human being that is breathed into him by God. That's
ruach.
spirit. Yeah, ruach. That's exactly right. And it is and it is different from the soul. And it's also I would say that the spirit is also tied to the natural. The fact that you have a spirit is why you could also I would tie this to St. Maximus the Confessor's idea about the natural will, right?
Mhm,
There's this part of you that has
mhm.
come from God in the first place that is always wanting to be reunited with God and knows the good. But and it's actually the soul is the part that gets you off course because the soul is that it because the soul is that principle which unites all your parts, but it is also can be enslaved by the parts into sin. So, um, does that are you following me so far? That's the distinction I'm making, and I'm pretty sure that's the distinction Bach is
Okay,
making too.
I think that's helpful.
Okay, so
I also liked the idea, like he talks about the, just as a kind of a trivial, piece of information, in fairy tales, ancient stories, white, red, and black were always um, indicative of spirit, soul, and body.
right,
So, and he makes reference to Snow White, which he does a
yep.
couple of times actually. White
He
as snow.
talks about he talks about the pelican too.
Yeah, and then in the Christian sacraments, I don't know about the Catholic Church, but in the Orthodox Church, the priest wears black at Lent and red at Easter and white at the resurrection. So it's an inversion
Right,
of the four horsemen, right? Which
right,
is kind of interesting.
yeah. And that materiality, I think that materiality of the black horse is like, even though so like the pale horse like represents, I would say, like a full-on descent into the demonic and the path towards spiritual death, right? The part that shouldn't be able to die. because it's the part that's given to you
Well,
by
I
God.
think I think this would be Luke's favorite part here, the pale horse.
So,
That's a teaser
so yeah, yeah.
to tell.
So we do you want to can you guys go longer?
Yeah.
I can.
I'm like, my email box is looking good. I can probably continue.
Okay.
At least try to talk about the material. So I am saying, even though Bock doesn't tie, he ties it to materiality. I am, by its connection to materiality, I am tying it to death.
Well, I'm
And
going to stick with
and
Bob.
and not only that, I'll tie it into I will tie it to, not only that, I will tie it to the sucking the life out of the world.
I think it's the wages, right? The wages of sin is death. And I think that's what the black horse is. It's the wages. It's the
Well, it's
price you pay. It's because he talks about it in these transactional terms, right?
right, because it's
Leads
connected to this.
individualism and well, actually, the red horse leads to individualism, and then you get this transactionalism. And I mean, that can be mapped onto all
Because you know
kinds of
why
ways.
though? Because mammon is the ultimate idol.
Yeah. Well, this
It's
transactionalism.
it's an infinite idol.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a false infinity. It's a quantitative infinity.
We should
But
just read what
yeah.
it says here because it does a really good job.
Good.
Go
Read
for
it.
it.
So, at the present time, it ought not to be difficult to understand this further plunge of human intelligence, a plunge expressed in the transition from the black to the pale horse. Straightforward materialism has still some character. Bloodless abstractions are inhuman.
Mhm.
With abstractions, one can reprove and refute anything. Mere intellectualism has no roots left. It ceases to take thinking seriously. It is long since man first began to absorb into himself what had formerly been the prerogative of God. Now he no longer engages even his own human nature fully in his thought life.
Yeah.
He does not even notice how thinking slips from him and begins to lead a spectral life. The black horse symbolized thinking fettered to the physical body, which is subject to death. When the pale horse gallops over the earth, thinking becomes ghostly. It is no longer only within man, it is beginning to haunt him like an army of specters. And then he starts talking about how it starts talking about technology basically. And
Yeah. He starts talking about the machine, and that's like, boy, that we could have spent the entire time, once he makes that transition. I think we could have spent the entire time just talking about that, because that, yes. I would say the other thing when you were talking there, and I think I thought about this when I was reading it too. It's like there's almost like you can see like kind of like a move from the modern to the postmodern going on in that too, where it's like, um modernity like might be wrong, but at least it was correctably wrong.
at least it has some optimism. It has some connection to
Right.
something. Yeah.
Well, I think,
yeah.
I think what stood out to me here, Nate, was that what materiality does is it disenchants everything.
Yes, that's precisely what I was pointing to, and to me that's to render it dead.
Yes.
because to enchant is to sing into being. So when you're disenchanting things, you are literally taking the life. So this is why I wanted to connect it to death, even though Bach waits until he gets to the pale horse to do that. I'm like, no, there's still at least a movement toward death going on with the
Yeah,
black
but
horse.
see, the reason that excuse me, the real reason that the pale horse is death is that the bloodless abstractions are inhuman, right? Like with the black horse, you have this smidgen of humanity left, but with the pale horse, everything is a specter, right? It's bloodless. It has no.
Yeah, he says the
Well, he
actual
says no roots,
yeah,
right?
he says the actual color of it is
Greenish yellow.
greenish yellow like sulfur. Yeah.
I
So
I've been reading Fantasties, and I have a quote here from there. The main character in the story, he somehow unleashes his shadow, and so he's in fairyland and he doesn't have a shadow, and now all of a sudden he has a shadow, right?
yeah, I remember that part of the book. Yeah,
Yeah,
go
and
ahead, go for it.
he doesn't really like it. He doesn't really like having a shadow, but he doesn't really know what the shadow is doing or not doing.
Right.
And I thought it really tied in well to this because
I'm always open to you quoting McDonald at any time.
so he says, I'm just going to read it. It's a little bit long, but it's not too bad. In a few days, I had a reason to dread an extension of its baleful influences from the fact that it was no longer confined to one position in regard to myself. And he's talking about his shadow. Hitherto, when seized with an irresistible desire to look on my evil demon, which longing would unaccountably seize me at any moment, returning at longer or shorter intervals, sometimes every minute, I had to turn my head backwards and look over my shoulder, in which position, as long as I could retain it, I was fascinated. But one day, having come out on a clear, grassy hill, which commanded a glorious prospect, though of what I cannot now tell, my shadow moved around and came in front of me. And presently a new manifestation increased my distress, for it began to coruscate and shoot out on all sides a radiation of dim shadow. These rays of gloom issued from the central shadow as from a black sun, lengthening and shortening with continual change. But wherever a ray struck, that part of earth or sky or sea became void and desert and sad to my heart. On this, the first development of its new power, one ray shot out beyond the rest, seeming to lengthen infinitely until it smote the great sun on the face, which withered and darkened beneath the blow. I turned away and went on. The shadow retreated to its former position, and when I looked again, it had drawn in all of its spears of darkness and followed like a dog at my heels. Once I passed by a cottage. There came out a lovely fairy child with two wondrous toys, one in each hand. The one was the tube through which the fairy-gifted poet looks when he beholds the same thing everywhere. The other, that through which he looks when he combines into new forms of loveliness those images of beauty, which his own choice has gathered from all regions wherein he has traveled. Round the child's head was an aureole of emanating rays. As I looked at him in wonder and delight, round crept from behind me the something dark, and the child stood in my shadow. Straightway, he was a commonplace boy, with a rough, broad-brimmed straw hat, through which brimmed the sun shone from behind, and the toys he carried were a multiplying glass and a kaleidoscope. I sighed and departed.
Yep.
This
is exactly
is
why
the pale horse of
Well,
materiality, right?
Well, it's the materiality is the black horse is materiality, and that's why I connect it to death, because to me
Okay.
that's like what it that is. I mean, it's not a
Well, these are the bloodless abstractions, right?
right.
That's it. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Which I think is what materiality leads to. It
Yeah,
necessarily.
it's the step on the and it's in the progression. It's what's going to lead to the pale horse,
Mhm.
but it's slouching toward Gamora.
That's a new poem that needs to be written.
Oh, it's been. I think it's actually like I think Robert Bork actually wrote a book with that title.
It should be slouching towards gonorrhea.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Sexual license is certainly a large part of what's going on. There's no doubt about that. There's just no evading. There's no evading that. So, yeah.
Okay, so our deathly pale horse is done, right?
Right. Well, except for I do want to talk about how he connects it to the machine, though. He talks about like the images of like the things that it unleashes, and how and he connects it to the machine.
Yeah, that's kind of when he talks about the ousting of the horse. I could read that. In the virtual disappearance of the horse from public life, our civilization has undergone a veritable apocalyptic transformation. Only the superficiality of our age obscures the apocalyptic significance of the horse being superseded by machinery. Like the horse, the machine which has taken its place can be a reflection of a part of man's being. The ousting of the horse by mechanically propelled vehicles should really make us think. It is only through familiarity that we are no longer terrified at the sight of a vehicle whose source of locomotion we do not perceive. Machines are intelligence set free, become objective. They have placed man in the position of a magician's apprentice, the slave and whipping boy of his own inventions. Our intelligence meets us from without as a threatening spectral force. However paradoxical it may sound, so long as the horse was still at home on the streets of our cities, the communal life of man was more human. Since the horse has been superseded by machinery, man is in danger of being superseded by the beast or beasts, which the writer of the Apocalypse sees rising from the abyss. The pale horse has death and the demonic host of hell in his retinue. The first three seals depict the descent of divine intelligence to the human level. In the fourth seal, the danger of the human intelligence becoming demonic is revealed.
Right, and it's connected to this idea of inhuman intelligence.
Inhuman?
Yes. If you
Demonic.
go like, right,
Oh, yeah.
right. So well, that's what that's what will be an inhuman
Yeah.
intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So
Are you
So-
thinking AI? Are you thinking AI or what?
I think it's pretty hard for. I mean, even though he wrote this right after World War II.
Yeah.
And like I think a lot of what was motivating him was like the horrors that he witnessed during the war. I know for one thing, like the Christian community was persecuted by the Nazis.
Yeah.
And so certainly the war did not go easily for him. But it seems to like what he's talking about is only accelerated, and it seems to me that artificial intelligence is like the ultimate expression of that. It's like
Mhm. They're like locusts, these demonic powers, he says later on.
yeah,
And they have the power to hurt men. He says here, of course, it is not the purpose of the apocalypse to dissuade people from employing technical science. It would be foolish not to make use of the machines which our intelligence has constructed.
right.
But when we learn to see our mechanized civilization as a reflected image of our own human condition, we shall be obliged to confess that we can only employ technical science and continue to live at the same time as true human beings if we add to this external culture such a strengthening and cultivation of our spirit as provides the balance to increasing.
Which really echoes what Jacques Ellul argues in the Technological Society very closely too, because that's also like, I mean, you know, Ted Kaczynski did whatever he did with Ellul's thought, but that wasn't Ellul's point. Ellul's point was that we can't continue to be the blind slaves of technique, that we need to be conscious of its impact on us, or it will just continue to use us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and possess us really effectively.
What I liked about that quote was he says here, when we learn to see our mechanized civilization as a reflected image of our own human condition. I thought about that a lot because George MacDonald talks about that a lot, right? As when you're looking out into the world, what you're seeing is what's happening inside of you. It's kind of like I use this example of my right brain knowing that my son had headphones in his back pocket, right?
Right.
So it's like we need to when we look out at the world that we're seeing, as dismal as it might appear, we have to recognize it as because this relational ontology, we're making everything, right? We're co-creating, we're making each other, we're making the world around us. So whatever it is that we're in is what we've made, like it's in us.
Yeah, we're projecting it. Yeah,
right?
we're projecting it out onto the world for sure.
We're not victims in that sense. Like it's not a tornado or a hurricane that suddenly comes upon us, although we could be responsible for that too.
We're bringing into the world the vision that we see. So the key is to change our vision, which is kind of, this is definitely what he says too, because right after that he says The fall of humanity from the divine to the demonic was foreseen in the book of God's purposes, but the downward movement reveals its true purpose only if man ultimately reconquers the heights by strength of that freedom which he attains at the bottom of the valley. At
Yeah.
first, the white horse is given to him without his own effort or desert. He will be able to win it back in freedom through the strength to which he rises by his own endeavor. One of the names of the white rider is the Word of God. When man finds anew the way to receive the thinking of God into his own thinking and the Word of God into his own words, the downward movement can turn into an upward movement. If this is achieved, the bud of vision will open in the mind and will grow from the inmost center of man and from the indwelling divine ego. Man may ally himself with the white rider on whose beam gleam many golden crowns. So there's the optimistic.
So here's another quote from Fantastes
Okay.
in this regard. He says, if, for instance, it was a book of metaphysics I opened, I had scarcely read 2 pages before I seemed to myself to be pondering over discovered truth and constructing the intellectual machine whereby to communicate the discovery to my fellow men. With some books, however, of this nature, it seemed rather as if the process was removed yet a great way further back. And then he talks about trying to build propositions and how for some things he can't do that, right?
Right.
And
Right.
his library is the Bible, so
Right.
he's actually talking about all the books of the Bible, right?
Right.
When he mentions this, he says, I was trying to find the root of a manifestation, the spiritual truth whence a material vision sprang, or to combine 2 propositions, both apparently true, either at once or in different remembered moods, and to find the point in which their invisibly converging lines would unite in one revealing a truth higher than either and differing from both, though so far from being opposed to either, that it was that whence each derived its life and power. So, I like the way he's describing how, he's actually using geometrical images, right, of lines converging and building and taking propositions and, building this machine. But some things are just removed from him. And
Right.
and I wondered, like this book, Revelation, right? It feels like that we can't do that with, and that's the most frustrating part about Revelation for most people, is that you can't do that with it. It's removed from that.
Well, we can't do that with God either. I mean, ultimately, it's like, I mean, we can't like it's you cannot you cannot you cannot build a system to contain that which is cannot be contained. I mean, it's just it's a fruitless endeavor.
Well, I thought of the bloodless abstractions. We can't do that to the book of Revelation. We can't make it a bunch of bloodless abstractions, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah. Some of those
Yeah.
things are just removed from us. And I find that kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The one last thing I wanted to talk about, if you guys have time,
Mhm.
is I think we covered the Horsemen pretty well. There's a part where he talks about like the connection between the altar and the tomb.
Yeah.
That was to me that was interesting because like he's writing to me he's writing like how many years before Rene Girard ever picked up a pen or took to a typewriter, and like to me it's like particularly in the way that he talks about the way that the Christian Eucharist like changes the symbolism, right?
Yeah.
And turns the altar into a real altar so that it's no longer connected to the tomb, so that it becomes a place of resurrection. I just couldn't help but think about like the way that the altar is connected to sacrifice, and there's he's definitely like implying the exact like the exact move that Girard would make in comparing like the pagan idea of sacrifice
Yeah.
and what Christ does. to invert the idea of sacrifice entirely from what it had been in the pagan world. So so that like so the altar and the altar and the tomb are like symbolically connected. Like he talks about, like, standing at a coffin uh is standing at an altar.
Yeah. I have
Um
it here. Do you want me to read it?
yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Why is it the dead who are seen under and behind? Why is it the dead who are seen under and behind the altar? An altar always has the form of a tomb. The sarcophagus is the prototype of the altar. Whenever we stand by a coffin, we are in fact standing at an altar. At a coffin, we are in the presence not only of earthly beings, but also of beings of the spiritual world who overshadow the earthly. The souls of the dead form the lowest rank, the province next to us in the realm of spiritual beings. Since the empty tomb of Golgotha, however, the altar has become more than a tomb. It is the place of resurrection. And it's
Yeah, and
interesting.
the pagan altar was literally a tomb, right? Because it was a place of sacrifice. Like, it
Right.
was a place of death. So he's like, there is definitely something, like, there is something super deep and ancient and intuitive about this connection that he's making between altar and tomb, because the altar, when sacrificing under paganism, was absolutely 100% a place of death, and
Yeah.
Christ completely turns it upside down.
There's quite a bit of symbolism in iconography that has to do with that too. Like in the nativity icons, the manger is a little sarcophagus. It's a little coffin.
Oh, there you go. So that's right. Right.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That's like that really struck me. And yeah, I mean, that's like, to me, that's like, this is like one of my major problems with the thought of Jordan Peterson. Like, that's like the thing that I don't think he gets at all. Like, and for as much as he talks about sacrifice, he just, like, the way he talks about it is like, it's pagan. It's transactional, right? So he understands that, like,
He's stuck at the black horse.
reality has, right, yeah, reality has a cost, and sacrifice is a necessary part of reality. We've always understood that, right? We've always intuited that. That's why we have sacrificed.
Mm.
No one, and he's right to say that no one gets out of sacrifice. But the thing is like, what's missing from his idea of sacrifice is still like that you sacrifice for your future. It's still this pagan transactional kind of idea about sacrifice. Well, that's not, Christ turns that completely upside down.
So if these four horsemen are a fractal pattern, which I think they are, right? So they happen in the heavenlies, they happen, on the earth, and they happen in the inner cosmos of each individual, right? What's next for Peterson?
Well, I
The
don't know. I think he's just,
pale
I
horse.
think, what was that?
The pale horse is next.
The pale horse. Well, I hope he doesn't. I mean, it's like, well, I mean, in a way, you have to go
yes.
up, but don't we? Okay, now, okay, but don't we all? Here's the thing, though, is like, I think this is like, so this applies exactly. This applies not only to us collectively, but this also applies to
individually.
us individually too. Like, we start off as children in like this, state of innocence, like open to the world. The entire
Right.
world is alive to us.
Yeah.
We grow up and we fall into this mimetic rivalry where we have to pursue our career, and we enter
Exactly.
into this materiality, and then we can become like bitter and cynical and like be taken over by principalities and powers, and we all have to get to the bottom of that. That's why it's like, to me, it's like that. I mean, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again because it bears mentioning. It's like, the harrowing of hell is always ongoing.
Right. And that's why it's now.
Yes.
Right? That's why everything is now.
It wasn't just a one-time occurrence.
These four horsemen.
Christ is always saving you out of the bottom of that and raising you back up in the movement of ascent that Bock talks about in the section that I read. Like,
right.
That's like, but you got to go all the way down to the bottom.
You have to. It's the U-shaped journey.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless a seed dies, right? But this is Harding's 4 stages of life.
Yep.
This is exactly, these 4 horsemen are exactly the 4 stages of life, because you have to get to that final pale horse. of seeing all the ghosts of your bloodless abstractions, right? You have to see it for what it is. That's what the black horse made you believe was real, but it wasn't real, right?
Right, and it's seeing, it's seeing, and it's also, yeah, it is seeing. I mean,
You're seeing,
yeah, it really is that's what
you're
it comes down
seeing
to
ghosts.
is vision.
You're seeing ghosts.
Yes, right.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
And so like we often think, oh no, the pale horse, he's the worst because he's death. But then this is, like, what is death, right? Unless a seed dies.
Yeah.
Right? It's a
Yeah.
good thing.
Right. Right. I think a lot of like I don't think I think a lot of times like that like connection of the seed to death gets like missed a lot when people like interpret the um the mustard seed parable. Like
Mhm.
that gets missed. I was actually happy to see uh my priest at the church that my son and I attended, like the sermon he gave last week was actually like that exact sermon, and he did. He
Get
absolutely.
on that.
But he and guess where he got it from? Gregory of Nyssa.
Okay. Oh,
No,
Gregory.
Gregory.
Yeah, well, that's where John Bear got it from too.
Yeah, it's like he loves the Cappadocians, so I got a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You lucky cat. Yeah.
So thanks for the talk, guys. This was great.
Yeah. Thank you. It was really
Yeah.
good.
All right. Later.
Bye-bye.
Yep.